sono due capelli, una romantica, che era praticamente abbandonata, ridipinta tanti volti. Hanno trovato questo, che era banca, era cosa.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this beautiful hall, which is known as the Hall of the Grandmasters, because not only of the paintings around you, there were 28 Grandmasters who ruled over Malta from 1530 to 1798. These are just some of them, but up there, the busts, some of them are Grandmasters who ruled in Malta, and some are the Grandmasters who ruled in Rhodos, in Rhodes, and even the founder of the order, Blessed Gerard, over there, he was the founder of the order. It wasn't even called Grandmaster, they were called Masters at first. In the 15th century, the title was kind of elevated to Grandmaster. And by the way, let me introduce myself. My name is Albert Stolcer. It's not a Slavonic surname, but it sounds like in Slavonic country they call it Stolce. But it's an Italian surname. And I have written about music for many, many years. I've also studied it very deeply. The background to it was I'm also very deeply interested in history in general. Now, the whole purpose behind this concert is that Milica Lawrence, all of you know who Milica is, and she is a brilliant teacher, performer, and she plays everybody's music. She plays music by English composers, by German composers, by French composers, everything. And sometimes she also likes to introduce music from her home country. And her idea behind this is to, yes please do come in, it is to familiarize audiences. Some of you may already know certain names which are going to crop up during this performance, but others hardly know anything or nothing at all. I was telling a friend yesterday, I said, tomorrow, blah, blah, I'm going to do this, because the idea behind Milica's recital is to familiarize even local music lovers about music about which maybe they have never heard. If they haven't, it would be a start. If they have, it would be adding something to what they know already, which is also the case with me. I mean, nobody knows everything at all. So it all starts. She said she had this concept of music from Yugoslavia, but as you know, Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. That region, very, very interesting for its different cultures, languages, religions, whatever. A very turbulent region, of course. Nothing can remain very still anywhere. And when the First World War was over, some new countries were created. For example, Poland had been divided between Germany, Austria, and Russia. It didn't exist on the map. And Poland was recreated. Then there was the question of the different races in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because from Austria it became Austria-Hungary, because the Hungarians wanted equal rights. And then the Hungarians had their own minorities. The Hungarian minorities were the Slovaks, the Romanians, and the Croats. And the Croats were also very annoyed with the Hungarians, because in 1102 they freely joined a partnership with the Kingdom of Hungary as equals and with the right to be autonomous. But over the years, the more powerful Hungarian side gradually grabbed this power and that thing, and they became more or less like subordinates. And the Slovaks never had that same chance. And in Romania there was another problem. So anyway, the idea was people of the same race and same language and same culture should be together in one country. It could work, for example, when a large area of Hungary was given to Romania, because the majority there were Romanian speakers, but there were large minorities of German speakers and also Hungarian speakers. Then the question of Bohemia, Moravia, The Czech people lived in those countries, and Slovakia, they are like cousins. The languages are very similar. If you know one, you know the other, or you understand the other. But there was always some friction between them. But anyway, they became Czechoslovakia. What was happening in the south? In the south, you had Slovenia, the Slovenes, who had been under Austrian rule, and then you have the Croats under Hungarian rule. There was the independent kingdom of Serbia, and the smaller independent kingdom, mainly known by its Italian name, Montenegro, but the real name is Crna Gora, the Black Mountain. And it was a smaller independent monarchy. And at the end of World War I, King Nicola of Montenegro was kind of pushed aside. Serbia took over, and then the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. This was 1919, Treaty of Versailles. And they were joined together under one system. Monarchy, and the monarchy, of course, who was the strongest element? Serbia. So the Serbian king became king of the whole kingdom. The Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. If you look at the map, the Serbs will be here. The Croats further up, and the Slovenes in the northern part. And things went bad, unfortunately, and the king had to proclaim his own personal rule because there was too much trouble between the main factions, between the Croats and the Serbs. And King Alexander who had been king of Serbia when his father Peter abdicated at the end of World War I, he became king. And when 5 years later, 1934, he was on a state visit to Marseille in France, he was assassinated by Croat extremists. They were plotting it many months before when they knew that was going there. And they not only killed him, but they also killed the French foreign minister. And that, of course, led to a regency. Then the shadow of Nazi Germany started looming over the region, and when Mussolini made his stupid attack on Greece from Albania, and instead of conquering Greece, was pushed back into Albania, he panicked, and Hitler had to send an army. The Yugoslavs said, no, we don't want you to come to our country, but they bombarded Belgrade on the 6th of April 1941, exactly 3 years before my birthday. That's why I remember it, not because I was there, but for history. And they never conquered the whole country. That has to be put in mind. At the end of the war, they were the only formerly occupied country which freed itself from German occupation, not by the Red Army. And as you know, Tito, who was the dictator when the monarchy was abolished, he had a very strong hand, and he managed to keep them together. But again, when he died, it collapsed. And so the composers today are all born before Yugoslavia was created, and they were active during the first period of the kingdom, when it was with that official title, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and then Yugoslavia, which literally means the southern Slav people. And again, very interesting, all this like a recipe, different elements. The first composer, whose music you're going to hear shortly, I hope I'm not being too long, but some things have to be said to put you in the picture, is Dora, or Theodora Pejacevic. It's a tongue twister. Pejacevic. And she was actually born in Budapest, the capital of Hungary, from a Croatian family from the nobility, but they had Hungarian roots long back. And Pejacevic, or Pejacevic Eva, maybe it would be called in her country, she was self-taught. She did have a brother, if I'm not mistaken, but she was literally a very, very brainy young woman. She was already learning by herself, learning piano. In fact, she became an expert in writing beautiful piano miniatures. And not only that, she learned mostly on her own. She never went to any kind of academy or conservatoire to study, never. But she observed, she listened, she mixed with musicians, she mixed with the literary giants of the time, like Schopenhauer, Rilke, even though she didn't know Nietzsche, because Nietzsche had died in 1900, I believe, when she was 15. She was born in 1885. And she was influenced by his writing. She even wrote songs to lyrics written by Nietzsche, by Rilke, as I said before, and other great names. Krauss, for example, nothing to do with the singer Krauss. He was a German. Schopenhauer, for example. And these were deeply rooted ideas into her music. She chose the subjects according to, of course, the lyrics and the effect of having meaningful words set to music. She was the first Croat composer to compose a piano concerto. Her piano concerto was, I believe, in, where was it? It's on the other page, just a moment. It was composed in 1913, and she was also the first composer from her country to compose for a large orchestra, a symphony in F-sharp minor. And the piano concerto was, here it is, in 1913. In 1913, she was not even 20 years old. She was composing what you are going to listen to later, what was composed even before, when she was 19 and 20, 1904, 1905. Remember, she was born in 1885. And she was also the one who introduced the orchestral song in the Croatian language. She wrote songs in Croatian, but not just songs with piano accompaniment, but with orchestral accompaniment. She wrote also for piano accompaniment. And her idea of music and her way of life, for example, she said, I cannot be lazy, I can't understand how people cannot work, because being an aristocrat, she didn't have any reason to work for a living. She could live, off her family. And in fact, when it came to her dying wish, when it came to that, she said, I don't want to be buried in the family grave. I want to be buried outside the church, not far from the family grave, with just a simple thing, a simple little monument on which my name is written. She married relatively late. Usually young ladies at the time, by the time they were 20, they were already married. But in 1921, when she was 36, she married a man 7 years her junior, he was 7 years younger. He was Ritter von Lubbe, Ottomar Liberal, and the next year she became pregnant, and the year after she gave birth to a son. Unfortunately, because of complications and because of infections, she lost her life, she died, leaving this little boy, a baby, who was to live to be 8 or 9. He died very recently, in 2012, and she died giving birth to this child. And her husband, of course, lived to be 86 as well, so they were both not here. At the beginning of 1897, age 12, she composed her first composition. She composed in all 106 works, which are gathered together in 58 opus numbers. Now, what you're going to hear from the pen of this amazing woman. She was a very beautiful woman, by the way. If you look for her on Wikipedia, you will find a beautiful photograph of her when she was, I think, in her 20s. And this is officially called Life of a Flower, Opus 19, 1904, 1905 year of composition. It has 8 pieces. Originally, the titles were in German. When I found them, some of them I could easily understand the name of the event, like Snowdrop is number 1. You have the violet, the supposedly humble violet. You can't even see it. It hides under petals, but you can always smell its beautiful scent. Lily of the Valley, the Forget-Me-Not, which I believe is a tiny yellow flower, the Forget-Me-Not. And rose, of course, everybody knows the rose, in so many different colors. And the red carnation, lilies, and finally the chrysanthemum. The chrysanthemum is a flower where in the East, in the Eastern, in Indian and Japanese culture, they are linked with mourning, with when somebody dies, they use this flower as a kind of symbol of the passing away from this life to the next, for those who believe in the afterlife. And every country has believed in that since the beginning of time. So now it's time for you to listen to Milica, who will perform this series of 8 beautiful. If you listen to the music, you can imagine a description. If you know what they look like, these flowers, you can imagine from the notes that they are really good descriptive music. Thank you, Milica. when the others were so full of life. And I also wanted to remind you that Dora Pejacevic was a very romantic composer. First, you could hear shades of Liszt or Brahms, even on Rachmaninoff. But that was a particular period before World War I. In World War I, she volunteered as a paramedic in the Austro-Hungarian army, and what she saw before her eyes, the results of war, the carnage, the blood and everything, it made her change her attitude towards life, and she leaned towards something more kind of radical, universal, and it could also show in her music, because this music was when she was only 19, 20, fully romantic. She composed her later music after 1917. She didn't have much time after that. She died 6 years after she was a paramedic. But she was moving closer to the ideas of the Second Vienna School, you know, the dodecaphonic scale and harsher harmonies or lack of harmonies, dissonance, and so on. And now we come to the second composer. The second composer, as you can hopefully read your, it's a bit dark, I think. It's Miloje Milojevic. Milojevic. And he was originally, the family were not even called by that surname. They were known as Georgievich. Not Kara Georgievich, the royal family of Serbia, Georgievich. And he decided, in that upsurge of nationalism after World War I, when the country became independent of foreigners, and it was being ruled by its own people, not by governors or by other monarchs, they found this kind of pride in their nationality. So he decided to adopt a name which sounded more like, I would say, Josip Josevic or Vissarionovic. It's typical patronymic names of Slavonic, most Slavonic people. And he was born in 1884 and died in 1946 at the age of 61. He didn't even reach the age of 62. Later on, you will listen to 4 piano pieces, Opus 23, dated 1917, so they are very early work. And to say a little bit more about him, he was a master of many disciplines. He was composer, musicologist. He collected folk music from many different parts of old Yugoslavia. And he was a critic, pedagogue, because he was very famous as a teacher. And he also studied widely. He studied, for example, for a while in Serbia. Then went to Germany, to München, what the British call Munich, Monaco de Baviera to the Italians. And this city was a very active city musically, like Leipzig was, like in München it was the home of Richard Strauss, a very important composer of the period. And he also studied in Prague, another Slavonic country, but don't forget Prague was mainly, even then, more of a German than a Czech city. It was Czech in the countryside, but there were a lot of social structures and academies, and they were very in the German form, so to say. And he also studied under, I think it was called Vyacheslav Novak, who was a Czech composer who died in 1949, I believe, post-war, post-Second World War. And so all these influences took a kind of an effect upon his compositions. He was encouraged at home by a Serb specialist and musicologist called Isidor Bajic, who unfortunately died at a very young age, in his mid-30s, during World War I. And you have to remember that World War I started, like the immediate reason was what happened in Sarajevo, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife were assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. And of course this gave the opportunity and the excuse for Austria-Hungary to make impossible demands upon Serbia. They said, no, we want to conduct the investigation. And no sovereign country could allow another country to interfere that much into their own affairs. I mean, because that means lack of sovereignty. So the war started. Unfortunately, Serbia was conquered by the Austro-Hungarian armies. So it was a very difficult time for people there to continue with their normal lives. Yet many of them managed. This kind of spirit to carry on prevailed, instead of despairing completely. What can we do? And sitting in a corner doing nothing. They continued with these, at least with these intellectual and artistic, as far as could be permitted. Because in fact, Milojevic was drafted into the army in the middle of the conflict. So he had to go around, I believe, transporting truckloads, or not trucks actually, horse-drawn carts to distribute bread supplies to either to people in need or to the soldiers on the front. And he also is notable for being the first Serb composer to win and study and defend a thesis as doctor in musicologist, because he was very, very keen on, as I said, collecting folk music from Kosovo, from Macedonia, from Bosnia, from everywhere, because these were slowly dying out. And for example, Bela Bartok was doing that in Transylvania, in that part of Romania, which at the time when he was doing this work, and Kodai as well, Zoltan Kodai. And in fact, he was also at the head of a group of I wrote their names so I don't forget, Petar Kozjovic and Stefan Hrstić. And these were all of more or less the same generation, born in the 1880s. One died in 1970, lived much longer, the first one, and the other one died in 1958. He was the unluckiest one because he was 61 when he died. And he represents, I have to read this because it's a quote, a very direct quote I found. He represents a generation of composers in Serbian history who introduced modern elements and complex technical levels to Serbian music. So now we're going to hear 4 piano pieces, as I said, composed, Opus 23, composed in 1917, and they are: one is An Old Tale, number 2 is Melancholic Evening, number 3, At Dusk, The Lily Was Dreaming. Can you imagine the lily at dusk dreaming? Who knows what? And In the Garden is the last one. In the Garden, in brackets, is known as the Ladybird's Lullaby. The ladybird is a beautiful little insect which belongs to the beetle family. And unfortunately, when we were children, when I was a child, and we used to find ladybirds, there was a little thing we used to say. I say to Monty, some people, nanna kolla, murre skola, apatsidjo, which means ladybird. Come on my finger, go to school and take a stool and start jumping up and down. We used to say, I haven't seen a ladybird in many years in this country, because unfortunately they are the best to kill pests which harm fruit trees. Instead of insecticides which are harmful to everybody, in some countries abroad they breed ladybirds and they let them loose on fruit orchards, and they clean up all the mess and they save the crop for the next year. Unfortunately, in Malta, I haven't seen one, like a glowworm, the Muspihille Maltese, which means the night lamp, so to say. You used to see them in summer. About 2 years ago, I discovered about 5 or 6 on my garden wall on the left, and I never saw them again. I hadn't seen them for 30 years, maybe. That is more than life, unfortunately. So Milica will come to delight us with the music of Milojevic. In the 90s, and this has something to do with glowworms or fireflies or le lucciole, sono conosciute in italiano, lucciole. And I used to stay at friends in New Jersey, and whenever I went to New York City, I used to return by Greyhound, and the shortest cut from the station to the house was across a beautiful cemetery. You say, oh, never mind, but it was on a flight, but usually at the far end you could see cars going by, and it was the quickest way back. And not for the first time, I would be walking, this very, very pleasant, very peaceful place, obviously, and suddenly I would be startled out of my wits, not because I saw ghosts rising up from graves, but it was Canadian geese. They like to stay behind the headstones. You know, we've seen American and North America cemeteries are like beautiful parks. There's nothing ghostly about them. So there are headstones, and they hide or they sit down to spend the night there. And they are more afraid of a human being than a human being should be afraid of them, because they start honking wildly. But again, to make up for it, I always used to see this beautiful array of glowworms flying all over the place, as if they are guiding me along the way. It's not that their light is so strong, but I thought that I should tell you that, because I used to go there every year, and from there go to some other part of the world, in Central America, like Guatemala, and all Central America, etc. And then go back via New York. And I always used to have to go across the cemetery, which I never found anything frightening about it, absolutely. And I think you noticed how much bolder this music was than the previous, because the writing is kind of stronger. Although it was an early work by Milojevic, it already showed signs of being different. But even so, even though the writing is bolder, certain human emotions remain the same, no matter in which way they are dressed musically. So, especially I noticed that there was a lot of sadness in the melancholic piece, like there was in the last piece from the Flower Song. Now, we come to the last composer, who was a really very distinguished man. His name was Josip, which is Josip. In Catalan it's Josep, it reminds me of Maltese, Josep in Catalan. And so Josip, or Joseph, so to say, Stolcer, which is a very German surname, incidentally, like my friends in New Jersey who are Slovene with a German surname. But at a certain point he decided he wanted to change his name to the very German sounding Stolcer. He added the other surname, Slavenski. He added it. I don't know whether it belonged to his mother, but anyway. And another thing which I couldn't find, unfortunately, I looked and looked and looked and looked, but I could not find out when he composed the three pieces which Milica will eventually perform. And he also was exposed to a lot of Hungarian musical influence, because he studied under a certain Siklos, and also Zoltán Kodály and Béla Bartók, who were contemporaries, and they lived a very long life. Well, at least Kodály did. Bartók was 64 when he died of leukemia. But Kodály really lived for a very long life, and he was very, 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 very important for the development of music in general. And he also studied with Novak, this Slavinsky, and that was about a couple of years after World War I. But he also eventually ended up in Belgrade. In Belgrade he became a member of the academy, he was a teacher, etc. But he also went to France. He lived in Paris for a year, and that also had a very important influence on his music, because that was the time when there was this group, Les Six, the six principal French composers of the time, who included Francis Poulenc, for example, one lady, I forgot her name. Then there was Darius Milhaud, Honegger, and another group altogether. And sometimes Eric Satie was with them, when he chored with them, instead of 7 they became 6 again. And so you can see, you can feel certain influences. And not only that, he was the first Serb, or in this case Yugoslav, because he lived in what was Yugoslavia, to reach international fame, not only in Europe, but also in North America. Because North America, sometimes we hear horrible things coming out of that place, but where music is concerned, it's taken very, very, very seriously. Some of the greatest composers of modern times came from there. Even in lighter music, like the musicals, the theatre musicals, they are a class above everybody else's. And I have to read word for word what an English musicologist said of him, because it's very important. He said that this was a man called Jim Sampson. Nothing to do with Samson, the one who broke down the temple. He says this of him: undoubtedly one of a very small handful of truly major composers from southeastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And southeast here also includes places like Greece, like Xenakis and Skalkotas and other composers who came from that country. And this is a kind of certificate of how important he was. And unfortunately, after 1940, because maybe his musical ideas didn't find approval from, unfortunately, when there are dictatorships, they try to interfere into every department of a human being's life, how they should write poems, how they should compose. An artist is free to compose. A painter is free to paint what he feels. We may not agree with it. We may not see certain, things like that, and they are supposed to bring happiness. That's what it meant to him. Why suppress it? Is it going to kill anyone? But no, they want to impose, and because of that, his music was practically ignored. From 1940, he lived in Belgrade until he died in 1958, I believe. Yes, 1958. And practically, he was forgotten. The music was neglected. I see Milica nodding in approval. But fortunately, as she knows, and as I found out, his music has been kind of rediscovered and promoted. And Milica has doing a little bit to promote some of his music. And as I said, I have no idea during which period of his life he composed it, but it's being studied. Musicologists are going deep into it, and a lot of it has also been recorded, fortunately. So those of you who come across, maybe through some ways of ordering it from abroad, because I don't think you'll find it in our record shops, you can get yourself acquainted better. So may I ask Milica, please, to come out again. And first of all, the second one, song and dance.
The first one was from Croatia.
From Croatia, but he's a Serb composer. Yeah. Okay? And the second one is an ancient Slavic, I think it's an Orthodox hymn, yes? Yeah. Prayer. And the last one is a Croatian dance, a real Croatian dance. Okay, so here we are. Ladies and gentlemen, a piece from Croatia by the same composer. Okay. Stolcer-Slavenski.
From 1st to 9th of November. So there will be a concert of our students, our teachers as well, and from the pianists from abroad. You are very welcome. All events are free. Entrance is free, but please, if you want to come, book the seat in advance. Thank you very much.
I see some young people here who are very, very attentive, Amber, whom I know already very well done, paying attention and not falling asleep. don't need to see by a boring old man. Anyway, so thank you very much. It was a great pleasure for me to be here in this wonderful atmosphere with all these very serious faces looking down upon us. But anyway, I'm sure they must have enjoyed the music as well.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. See you again sometime. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Oh, good to see you.